Oh, that's nice. Okay, so today we have the distinct pleasure of having Sal Agosta speak with us, and we also have a couple special guests in the lab right now. Dan Brooks and Eric Hoberg are visiting for a couple of days. So I'm going to go ahead and let Dan Brooks go ahead and do the introductions for Sal, and I'll let you go ahead and take it away. I've started the recording and it's ready to go. So thanks a lot, Dan, for being here, and Eric also, and to Sal for agreeing to do a talk today. So take it away, Dan.
Super. Thanks very much, Scott. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sal Augusta. He's a now I can say a longtime friend. We've known each other about 20 years now, interestingly enough. Sal's an associate professor in the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is the originator of the concept of sloppy fitness space, and the person who's been most effective in linking sloppy fitness space with ecological fitting to give us some really important insights into the issue of why evolution keeps going and why things keep surviving. And that's mostly what he's going to talk about today. So I'll just let Sal take it away.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Dan, and thanks, Scott, for inviting me to do this again. I'll just say from the outset, I said this last year, there's a lot of overlap here with what others have said and what's been said before. My goal is to kind of focus on doing a deep dive into the evolutionary theory part of all this. And then at the end or throughout, I'll make reference to parasites and emerging disease and kind of come back to that at the end. Also apologize. This is largely things that I've presented on before, hopefully told in a little bit different way, but forgive me if you've heard this before. Okay, so the take-home message. Let's start with the take-home message. So the take-home message is that, first of all, the biosphere is an evolutionary system, and it survived countless previous kinds of and frequencies and intensities of perturbation. The way it's done this is by evolving, and essentially evolving is constantly coping with change by changing. So it's an evolutionary system that constantly copes with change by changing. And fundamentally, it's all about survival. It's all about being good enough to deal with, number one, the current conditions, and number two, changes in those conditions. And you have to be able to do both to persist. And an overarching message of the talk and of this group in general is that we can actually better mimic how nature works and increase the odds of our own survival by mimicking that process, including how we deal with emerging diseases. And we'll come back to that at the end. And a lot of this, or pretty much everything I'm about to be said here, is synthesized and summarized in these three books and a ton of literature that these books summarize. So I'll just move on because I think we've all seen this before. So the Stockholm paradigm. Basically, what I'm going to be talking about here has been dubbed the Stockholm paradigm in the last 10 years or so. What is the Stockholm paradigm? Fundamentally, it's an eco-evolutionary framework that describes how living systems cope with change by changing. And very basically, it combines organismal capacities with ecological opportunity and the repeated external perturbations to the environment that catalyze evolutionary dynamics. And fundamentally, the Stockholm paradigm is rooted in Darwinism, and we can say it's been under construction really since Darwin. If we go back to the beginning and we look at the origin of species, we can define Darwin's fundamental question as how do organisms that evolve to function under one set of conditions, how do they keep functioning when those conditions change? This is the fundamental evolutionary question. And Darwin provided the short answer, and the answer is they use inherited information And that information contains the potential to do something new, like, for example, switch to a new host, if we're talking about parasites. So more specifically, if we think about the fundamental question posed by Darwin, there's two levels to the understanding how the biosphere actually persists. At the first level, the question is really, how do individual inheritance system use the limited information they have to cope with change? Inheritance systems being individuals, population, species, and then scaling up, how do ecosystems persist in the face of constant change? And if we go back to the origin of species, Darwin presents two major metaphors for really his grand theory of how nature works. The first being the tree of life, right? The tree of life that depicts the selective accumulation of biodiversity and its evolutionary history of common descent. But the second being the entangled bank. And the entangled bank is really a portrayal of the interactions among the biodiversity in the tree of life and gives rise to our modern notion of complex ecosystems and food webs. At any given moment, the entangled bank is really a snapshot of a dynamic evolutionary system. So in looking at it that way, we can define the central question as, how do these systems and their constituent members actually persist in the face of constant change? And again, to answer this, we have to look at first the level of individual inheritance systems, individual species, and then move up to the level of ecosystems. And that's what we're going to do here. So to begin with, how do individual inheritance systems cope with change? And we'll start with this quote from Darwin, from The Origin, that Dan highlighted in this paper. So the quote goes, there are two factors in evolution, and this is what Darwin said very early on in the book, namely the nature of the organism and the nature of the conditions. So right away, Darwin recognized that there's two elements here, the organism and the conditions. And he goes on to say that the former seems to be much more important. So the nature of the organism is more important than the nature of the conditions. And he makes the observation, number one, that we get similar variation that arise under different sets of conditions, pointing to the nature of the organism being dominant. And also we get dissimilar variation arising under similar conditions. So this is his assertion that the organism takes precedence in evolution. So really what was different from Lamarck in terms of what Darwin said is that he rejects the notion that the environment is somehow in charge, right? That it somehow pushes or pulls organisms to get better. Rather, he asserted that it's the nature of the organism that drives evolution. So instead of viewing the surroundings as some kind of creative force that pushes or pulls organisms, he actually viewed it as the arena in which organisms impose themselves on and use the information they've inherited to try to survive and reproduce. So he recognized the primacy of what he called the nature of the organism. So what is the nature of the organism? Right? A couple ways that we can think about this. The first thing we can say about organisms is that they are cohesive functional wholes. Right? They're cohesive functional wholes. They contain the informational capacity to, again, impose themselves on their surroundings in ways that facilitate survival and reproduction. Most fundamentally, organisms are a combination of metabolism and inheritance. So they're a combined metabolic inheritance system. And critically, this gives them the ability to both exploit and explore their environments. Organisms use metabolism to stay alive, right? This is how they exploit their surroundings as best they can with their inherited capacities, essentially giving them the ability to buy the time for reproduction to occur. Inheritance, on the other hand, is how organisms extend themselves through time, and essentially is what allows them to explore their surroundings through producing highly similar but variable offspring. And the combined metabolic inheritance system is, again, is a cohesive functional whole where the information encoded in inheritance specifies the metabolic system and where metabolism fuels inheritance. Organisms are also historical entities. They form communities of descent with shared evolutionary history, of course, represented by the tree of life. But even more to the point, they retain so much of their evolutionary history in inheritance that common descent is always the predominant explanation for their current form and function, not the surroundings. So, for example, if we take some fruit flies and we rear them in the wild, or if we rear them in a glass bottle in a laboratory, the result is still fruit flies, right? And that seems pretty not very profound, but it actually is profound. It speaks to the primacy of the nature of the organism over the nature of the conditions. Okay, so, sorry. So the primacy of the nature of the organism over the nature of the condition stems from inheritance. And there's really four fundamental aspects of inheritance that fuel this. So the first thing to recognize about inheritance is that it's highly conservative. The inheritance system is, of course, open to change through genetic mutation, duplication, recombination, and so forth. But nevertheless, it's highly constrained by the requirement for functional integration with the rest of the system. So inheritance is highly conservative. Number two, inheritance produces indefinite variation, right? Despite its conservative nature, all offspring are highly similar, but they're unique because of imperfect copying, duplication, recombination, and these things. And in fact, even clones have been shown not to be identical. So it's highly conservative. It produces indefinite variation. It's also highly historical. So while each organism is unique, each of them bears a very strong resemblance to its relatives. And again, some of these resemblances are, truly ancient, like Hox genes that code development of all metazoans, for example. And fourth, inheritance is superfluous. Organisms are going to produce as many offspring as they can without regards to the environmental conditions. So therefore, there's frequent reproductive overrun with the production of many more offspring than the environment can actually support. So putting this all together, conservative inheritance dictates that there can never be a perfect fit between organisms and the constantly changing environment. And so therefore, there's always some amount of evolutionary, it's been called evolutionary lag load. We can think of it as phylogenetic constraint or inertia. But there's some amount of phylogenetic constraint that makes it impossible for organisms to simply just evolve new capacities in the moment change occurs. So there's a constant mismatch between organisms and the surroundings. But from this mismatch is where natural selection actually emerges. And it's actually within this mismatch, within this imperfect fit, this is where lies the potential for coping with future change. This is where all the evolutionary potential lies. So if we think about a scenario where organisms or some species was somehow perfectly fit to the current conditions, then we might imagine that there'd be very little capacity to respond when those conditions change. And so Darwin recognized that the fuel for evolution is some constant supply of pre-existing variation to explore new opportunities when conditions change. So if we were to try to articulate what's the goal of life, then there's really the only goal, the discernible goal of life that we could really reasonably come up with is continued survival. The goal of life is to continue to survive. This is fueled by metabolism, but achieved through reproduction and inheritance. To be a good exploiter of the environment requires functioning well enough in the current conditions, but to be a good explorer requires being able to cope when those conditions change. And the fundamental point is that to be evolvable, organisms have to be able to do both. So they have to be able to exploit while maintaining the ability to explore. And it's the nature of inheritance, or the nature of information in the inheritance system, that produces this constant and indefinite capacity to explore and respond when the conditions change. And this is despite persistent natural selection for better performing variants. So the idea here is that while natural selection is constantly whittling variation down and selecting, better variants, nevertheless, there's always an underlying inherent capacity to produce indefinite variation and potential to respond to changing conditions. So where does this actually arise from? It arises from fundamentally, again, the nature of biological inheritance. So first of all, we've got at the very bottom mutation coupled with mistakes during replication and perfect copying. And of course, this provides some background source of variation. But second, the information encoded by DNA is both digital and combinatorial, right? And this is critically important in terms of the system producing prodigious amounts of indefinite variation. So if we think about DNA, it's digital in the sense that it can be recombined, it can be read at multiple levels of the genome, and it can be read at multiple times. This is versus it being analog, where it can only be read once as one complete string. So the fact that it's digital generates enormous amounts of information that gets both expressed but also unexpressed and is effectively stored in the inheritance system. Now, of course, there are constraints on the expression of this information. It's not all available to be expressed. And as evolution unfolds, these constraints build up, and they take the form of correlation between parts of the system. So, for example, genetic correlations constrain the diversity that could actually be expressed. Mate recognition systems, symbioses, all these things constrain what can be expressed. But despite this, the fact that replication is digital, and there's tons of recombination that goes on, this produces, again, enormous amounts of pre-existing variation, again, both expressed and unexpressed. Third, as the system evolves, so as evolution unfolds, the inheritance system diversifies. So the information within it expands, and so does the difference between the information that is expressed, which we'll call what's realized, so what's realized, and the information that could be expressed, which we'll call what's possible at any given time. So if you look at the figure here, it's showing an evolutionary system through time. At time zero, there's some minimal capacity, diversity, information, variation in the system. And as evolution unfolds, the system diversifies, those capacities grow. And they grow indefinitely, although the rate starts to slow down because of buildup of correlations and constraints in the system, like we talk about. But not only does that realized capacity grow, but the potential capacity grows. And this is Darwin's recognition that diversity begets diversity. Another way to think about this is that in any expanding system where we're accumulating information, variation, capacities, the realization of one possibility is always going to produce new possibilities. So in this way, thinking about it this way, life quite literally creates its own, what we've called capacity space to actually explore. Robert Ulanowitz called this the window of vitality. And the key here is that difference between, at any given time, what's realized, what is expressed, and what potentially could be expressed. This is tantamount to evolutionary potential. This is Ulanowitz's window of vitality. And just to make an aside to parasites, for example, this is the risk space for host switching and emerging infectious disease, right? This is all the potential for a parasite to do something new, like jump to a new host. Okay. So we can refer to this as the Brooks-Wiley dynamic because Dan and Ed Wiley produced all this and worked this all out back in the 80s. And it says, as evolution unfolds, what's realized becomes an ever smaller subset of what's possible, regardless of persistent natural selection for better performing variants. Okay. So as I said, the growth of this capacity space as evolution unfolds is indefinite, but it's not unlimited. Across the biological hierarchy, from molecules to genes and all the way up to species interactions and so forth, we get the buildup of historical correlations that limit what can be expressed. And we could refer to this as the cost of integration, right? So this cost of integration, this demand of maintaining a functional whole and integrating into a functional whole, places severe constraints on the rate of evolution and also the realm of possibilities that evolution can actually explore. So that's one point. But as a counterpoint, at the same time, this whole situation also facilitates evolution by lowering what we're going to call the cost of innovation in two important ways, right? So it lowers the cost of innovation first because conservatism, conserving all that potential information, actually reduces the threshold for generating new information, right? Genetic changes are not required necessarily for an organism to respond and do something new. It could access information that it already has. So for a parasite, this could lower the threshold for acquiring a new host because genetic changes may not be required. And just more generally, this alleviates the inability in evolution to simply produce the right adaptation at the right time in response to some change. The second thing conservatism does is it slows down the entire evolutionary process. Now, again, at first thought, that might seem to be severely limiting, which it is. But on the flip side, this buys a lot of time for pre-existing traits, for pre-existing parts of the system to actually meet and become integrated into some new functional whole. So the way we can look at this is that conservative inheritance stores history long enough to produce a constant and growing difference or lag between what's possible and what's realized for living systems. And the idea is that the persistent definitely relies far more on having the potential to cope when conditions change than on how fit an organism is to the current conditions. And this is a critical aspect of the Stockholm paradigm. For the Stockholm paradigm, the essential point is that all inheritance systems retain this potential to some degree, and even host-specific parasites, which we'll talk about towards the end. Okay. So this capacity to exploit and explore emerges from the nature of the organism. But the opportunities to do this, of course, are a function of the environment itself. So the nature of the conditions, the other side of Darwin's duality, gives rise to what we've termed opportunity space, where organisms can find chances for survival that are dependent on their inherited capacities. So the way we can think about this is for a given species, there's only a subset of the global opportunity space that's going to be suitable for their survival and reproduction. We could refer to this as realized opportunity space, or what is more commonly referred to as fitness space. So fitness space is something that emerges when we impose an organism and their capacity space on an environment and the opportunity space. And the critical thing to realize here is that organisms are fit for any conditions they have the capacity to survive and reproduce in. So this means that the fundamental demographic of evolution is not survival of the fittest, that's as it's often portrayed, but really more accurately, survival of the fit, right? Survival doesn't require being the absolute best. It only requires being good enough to cope with the conditions at hand. And any organism that reproduces is fit. And all organisms that reproduce compose a fittest collective. And it's this fittest collective, right? This range of variance, this genotypic, phenotypic distribution. This is what represents the evolutionary potential to cope when conditions change. So conservative inheritance all but guarantees that fitness space will be sloppy. This gets us to the notion of sloppy fitness space, as opposed to tightly optimized to any particular set of conditions. And this is critical for the persistent biosphere. It's this sloppiness, it's this difference between what you are doing and what you could be doing. That's the fuel, that's the potential to do something new when the conditions change. And the sloppiness is proportional to the difference between realized fitness space, so what you're actually doing, and fundamental fitness space, so what you actually could be doing. So the idea that fitness space is sloppy, again, very simply, just the idea that for any given organism, population, species, what they are doing is some subset of what they could be doing. Again, synonymous with the realized niche and fundamental niche. And that this difference is tantamount to evolutionary potential or the capacity to do something new. So just a little bit different look on this idea of sloppy fitness space and how this provides the fuel and really is the default evolutionary response when conditions change. We can imagine for some inheritance system, some species, if we define its environment very simply by two variables. So in the figure, we've got environmental variable X, environmental variable Y, doesn't matter what they are. And we could imagine that this population, this inheritance system, evolves in response to the ancestral or current conditions defined by that black square. And we would expect that the fitness space, the fitness, the range of conditions that this thing can perform under are going to be a function of those conditions. But as we've said, we expect things to have larger fundamental fitness spaces than realized fitness space for the reasons that we've talked about. So this could be a diagram, let's say, of an inheritance system with its fitness space mapped onto the environmental conditions. And the idea is that the sloppiness, the sloppy fitness space, allows room for creativity and innovation because there's always going to be some non-zero fitness space that's potentially available to exploit. So what might this look like? Well, if we think about this in terms of parasites, that box in the first panel, that might represent the ancestral host, the set of conditions that this thing evolves to. And there's this thing's fitness space, and it performs well on that host, but it also has some capacity to exploit other conditions, and perhaps it encounters another host and is able to actually co-opt some of its fitness space to now switch to that new host. So it could look something like that. It could be a new geographic area. It could be a new, really anything. So the take-home message or the important point here is that sloppy fitness space, the fact that there's this difference between realized and fundamental fitness space, is what allows many opportunities for ecological fitting. Ecological fitting being the phenomena where organisms in nature use the abilities they already have to respond to some new condition, right? To move to a new place, to use a new resource, to, eat something new, to parasite something new. And this is the default response for living systems when conditions change, is using what you already have to try to find new suitable conditions that were the same or similar to the old ones, or possibly different, but still within your capacity. And the key point is that to be evolvable, all species have to maintain an inheritable difference between the actual and the possible in fitness space. And this is how the biosphere has coped with constant change over 4 billion years, is inheritance systems constantly having the capacity to potentially do something new when conditions change. So if we start looking at the evolutionary process in a little bit more detail, we can kind of visualize how this all plays out. So understanding how species mount an initial response when the conditions change boils down to understanding what are the dynamics of inheritance systems in sloppy fitness space, right? This is kind of what it all boils down to. And since organisms are going to produce as many offspring as they possibly can, regardless of the conditions, we know that reproductive overrun is inevitable. So this produces Darwin's constant struggle for survival. This routinely puts organisms in conflict with their surroundings, including other organisms. So this superfluous reproduction means that any inheritance system can grow too much and become either a victim of its own success, right? So basically overpopulation, or if the conditions change, they could become victims of circumstance, right? And either of those situations, we all understand, can lead to natural selection, or what we're going to say can trigger Darwinian conflict resolution. So Darwinian conflict resolution in sloppy fitness space. Essentially, how does this play out in sloppy fitness space? So if we start in the first panel here, this is kind of how Dan and I have been visualizing this whole process, what we've been calling conflict resolution in sloppy fitness space. If we start in panel A, where conditions are stable, so we might imagine this as let's say, a population of parasites isolated on a single host species, let's say, organisms are going to exploit the surroundings as much as possible, and they're going to get concentrated in preferred portions of fitness space. And this is what we see in A, right? We see an inheritance system represented by the circles and the lines connecting it. We see its fitness space, and it's concentrated in a part of its fitness space. It's stable, it's in isolation, everybody's doing well. In this case, there's going to be a tendency, again, for the system to be specialized in this preferred portion of fitness space. The question is, what happens when the conditions change? Right? So when the conditions change, finding new opportunities for survival becomes paramount over exploiting the original conditions. And we can imagine what happens is inheritance systems now begin to spread out, right? They begin to spread out in fitness space. They become more generalized as they start to use pre-existing variation to essentially wander in their fundamental fitness space to maybe parts that were previously marginable, parts that were previously inaccessible, or maybe parts that weren't even available before, or didn't even exist before. So one of the keys to recognize here is that within the Stockholm paradigm, within Darwinism, the terms specialist and generalist, which are often pitched as nouns, as static things, are not nouns describing the static traits of static species, but they're verbs describing dynamic states that really any inheritance system could potentially be in. So from this perspective, just thinking about an individual inheritance system and its own fitness space, all inheritance systems, all species have the capacity to become more or less specialized or generalized in their own fitness space. And critically, all of them have the capacity to oscillate between these two conditions. And again, ecological fitting is the first step towards an inheritance system exploring what's possible, right? So basically moving from A to C, we're looking at ecological fitting take place. Now, if we get to C, and we've had, let's say, a bout of ecological fitting, a bout of something using its pre-existing capacity to move out and do something new in fitness space, we could see if that's all it was, then the whole process would actually be self-limiting. Right. So ecological fitting as a default response alone doesn't produce the selective accumulation of diversity that we each actually see in the biosphere. So conflict resolution requires an additional mechanism. And this mechanism is one that results in previously linked inheritance systems, essentially splitting apart into new inheritance systems, so speciation. So if we look at D, we've got this, what we're going to call a recently generalized inheritance system, an inheritance system that's responded to change in its environment by spreading out, finding new opportunities for survival and reproduction. Natural selection may now start to cause it to become more specialized in those various parts of fitness space that it's now spread out into. And ultimately, speciation may produce two new inheritance systems with their own fitness space. They may overlap, right, because of shared evolutionary history. But the point is, at this point, conflict has been resolved by diversifying under the new set of conditions. But because the nature of the organism always predominates, conflict resolution always leads to new conflict. And in fact, the idea is that so it goes, where Darwinian evolution is an iterative process of conflict and conflict resolution. Diversity accumulates rather than replaces itself because the criterion is to simply be good enough to reproduce. It's survival of the fit. And because each bout of conflict resolution sets the stage for some new conflict. And again, the fuel that drives this forward is the potential that emerges from the pre-existing capacities to first explore and then exploit new opportunities in the environment. When the conditions are stable, living systems build this potential. When conditions change, this potential is spent. So generating, maintaining, deploying this potential is the key to being evolvable. And we're thinking about parasites, it's the source of host switching and emerging infectious diseases. Okay. So scaling up to the level of ecosystems, ecosystem function is, of course, an emergent property of the activities of all the constituent members of all the individual inheritance systems. And each of these members, each of these inheritance systems has its own inherited capacities to exploit the current conditions and to potentially explore new conditions. And so we refer to ecosystems as centers of exploitation for their constituent members. These are places where species use metabolism to stay alive long enough to reproduce, while also retaining the capacity to explore new opportunities when the conditions change. And collectively, this gives rise to a collective evolutionary potential, as we've been saying, that's stored within ecosystems, or what Dan and I have called an evolutionary commons. So stored within ecosystems is an evolutionary commons, referring to the fact that evolutionary potential itself is the fundamental resource that the biosphere is, using to keep persisting in the face of change. So what happens when these systems get perturbed, right? When they get perturbed, the evolutionary commons gets expressed. And the expression of the evolutionary commons can result in, for example, ecological rewiring of trophic connections within ecosystems, so host switching, for example. But on a large enough scale, it can cause ecosystems to break apart, things to move around, biotic expansion, these types of things. When this happens, again, the default response is for organisms to use their capacity for ecological fitting stored in their inheritance systems to do something new, right? So there's the potential for new ecosystems to form out of the remnants of the old, is the point. And the evolutionary commons is extremely powerful. Again, it's the fuel for the biosphere to cope with change, and it makes the biosphere extremely robust and resilient to perturbations, not fragile as is often assumed. And one way to think about this and really just observe the robustness of the biosphere is to think about mass extinctions. And again, very often when we think about mass extinctions, we're thinking about all the things that went extinct, and sometimes miss the point that after each mass extinction, there's been mass evolutionary renewal, right? And this is renewal from the biodiversity that remained and that survived. So again, how much evolutionary potential was there in the biodiversity that remained after, for example, the extinction of the dinosaurs? Well, enough to go on to produce the biosphere that we're living in now, for example. Okay. So what happens when the conditions change so much that the dimensions of fitness space itself change for multiple species at once? So again, moving away from how do individual inheritance systems respond and cope with change, now we're going to ask, how does the collective biosphere, how do ecosystems, how do assemblages of species respond to change? So when the dimensions of fitness space itself are altered, let's say through global climate change, we would expect old opportunities to survive and reproduce to possibly disappear, but new opportunities to potentially arise. And of course, it's in the nature of the organism to take advantage of these new opportunities by exploring new parts of their own fitness space by using capacities that they already have. And as we said, if it was just ecological fitting in some kind of static fitness space, then this would be self-limiting. And somehow fitness space would just get filled by ecological fitting, and that would be the end of the story. But of course, that's not what happens. What happens is we get indefinite diversification because we get this constant interplay of conflict and conflict resolution, and therefore start to build a diverse and complex and persistent biosphere. So to build a diverse, complex, persistent biosphere requires an essential ingredient here, right? We need something to start essentially mixing things up and moving things around. And that essential ingredient is repeated systemic perturbations that routinely alter the fitness space of multiple species. And it's these perturbations that have catalyzed evolutionary dynamics, throughout life's history, and causes living systems to oscillate between exploiting and exploring both the geographical and functional dimensions of fitness space. And we're going to take a look at that part of it now. So repeated perturbations catalyze the dynamics where living systems essentially oscillate or can oscillate between exploiting and exploring their fitness space. Okay. So oscillating in geographical fitness space. There's something called the taxon pulse hypothesis that goes back to the 70s and 80s, and it posits that groups of species, or essentially biotas, experience fluctuations in their geographic ranges that are catalyzed by repeated changes in environmental conditions. And the idea is that for entire biotas regionally, for big groups of species, that when the conditions change, barriers to dispersal break down, species expand geographically. When that happens, they are effectively generalizing in fitness space and spending some evolutionary potential. And when conditions change again, dispersal barriers may reemerge, isolating species geographically and allowing for diversification to occur. And effectively, species are now specializing in their fitness space, accumulating evolutionary potential. So this is the taxon pulse hypothesis of how repeated perturbations can cause things to move around, diversify, and get mixed and matched very quickly. And there's a lot of evidence for the taxon pulse hypothesis driving geographic patterns in biotas. I won't belabor that. And the second part of this is organisms don't just live in space, but of course they're functioning. They're doing ecological functions, and so there's also the idea that not only are they oscillating in geographic space, but they're oscillating in functional fitness space. And if we imagine taxon pulses catalyzing large-scale movements, this catalyzes phases of exploration of new opportunities for survival during this movement, during these periods of geographic expansion, followed by phases of exploitation of those new opportunities during periods of isolation. So, along with fluctuating in geographical fitness space, the oscillation hypothesis posits that inheritance systems fluctuate between generalizing and specializing in functional fitness space. This is relatively easy to visualize for something like parasites. So for groups of organisms that form highly specific interactions with each other, like insects on plants or traditional parasites, we can draw a connection between host and function, and therefore between host space, the range of all hosts that could be used, and the actual functional dimensions of fitness space. So we expect host space to be sloppy, right? Just like the rest of fitness space. We expect there to be a difference between realized host range, so the set of hosts that are actually being used, and fundamental host range, the set of hosts that could be used. Okay. And there's a lot of evidence for oscillations in host range. Skip over that. We'll skip over that. So putting this all together, right? The whole idea is to avoid extinction, right? So how do inheritance systems, and then by extension, ecosystems, the biosphere, how does it continue to avoid extinction? And the short answer is by oscillating in this combined geographical functional fitness space in response to repeated external perturbations. So external perturbations like climate change may alter both the geographical and functional dimensions of fitness space for multiple species, affecting parts of or even the entire biosphere. If ecosystems were fragile, these perturbations would simply break them apart, and there would really be no capacity to reform. But because, again, there's a lot of evolutionary potential, because there's the evolutionary commons, ecosystems, the biosphere is actually very, very resilient, changeable in proportion to the diversity and capacities of all the individual members. And so from this perspective, the biosphere, the entangled bag, is constructed from repeated and overlapping cycles of taxon pulses and oscillations in functional fitness space across multiple spatial temporal scales. And it's this capacity for the individual inheritance systems to alternate between specialization and generalization in fitness space, and by extension, the collective biosphere, that allows them to avoid extinction. So the biosphere is robust, it's resilient, and it's responsive, but there are, of course, limits to its evolvability. So even though the information system produces prodigious amounts of capacity, tons of variation for living systems to potentially cope with change, they can't predict the future. And so therefore, inheritance systems are vulnerable to extinction. And of course, they routinely go extinct. So no matter how fit a species is in today's conditions, it can still be unfit tomorrow when the conditions change. So individual inheritance systems, the connections between them, they routinely go extinct, but the biosphere as a whole persists because of the capacity to absorb even massive perturbations. And this capacity arises from the dual explorer nature of species, right? Of living organisms and the collective biosphere as a whole. Okay, cool. So just to bring this back to parasites and some lessons for emerging infectious disease. So the overarching message is that we can't disentangle parasites and emerging infectious disease from the rest of the biosphere, and that host switching emerging infectious disease is an expression by parasites of the same exact evolutionary potential that we've been talking about that allows the rest of the biosphere to cope with change by changing. Now, of course, emerging infectious disease, big problem, costs a lot of money, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. And fundamentally, it occurs when some parasite colonizes an evolutionarily novel host, or it could be an old host that it hasn't been in contact with a very long time. And it results from host switching. Host switching being a result of the interaction between the capacity of some given parasite to infect a new host and the opportunity to actually meet these hosts. And if we think about historically how parasites have been viewed, they've actually been viewed very differently than how we're portraying them right now. We're portraying parasites as no different than any other kind of organism with a lot of underlying evolutionary potential to do something new if the conditions change. But historically, the historical caricature of parasites has been one of extreme specialization, which is true, right? From one perspective, they can be looked at as extreme specialists. They have highly intimate relationships with their hosts. They have very narrow host ranges, which speaks to this extreme specialization, where they're generally restricted to just a few closely related host species now or in the past. And they have been traditionally thought of as the classic evolutionary dead end. The idea being that if the host goes extinct, so does the parasite. Now, in the extreme, if this were true 100% of the time, there would be no emerging infectious disease. And oftentimes, the whole scenario is described as this ongoing co-evolutionary arms race that favors increasing specialization, and that this co-evolutionary arms race leaves essentially little or no capacity for parasites to colonize new hosts. This is kind of like, the old story. But we understand that host switching is actually a common phenomenon in nature, that emerging infectious disease is an emergent property of this larger phenomenon, and that the emerging infectious disease crisis implies that the capacity for host switching is actually large, and the opportunities to do so are becoming more common. So just some take-home points for EID. So the Stockholm paradigm implies that the risk space for EID is large, and that the realization of these risks increases the more ecosystems are perturbed. So we should expect more emerging infectious disease as biotic mixing plays out and parasites explore their fitness space. However, the risk space is non-random because inheritance is so conservative. The traits that are involved in parasite transmission to hosts, for example, are highly conserved and specific. So from that standpoint, emerging infectious disease emergence could be anticipated using proactive measures rooted in evolutionary principles. And of course, this is what the DAMA protocol that Dan and Eric and Walter have put forth in the Stockholm paradigm book. This is what it's all about, right? So DAMA stands for document, assess, monitor, and act. And the Stockholm paradigm provides a theoretical foundation for understanding emerging infectious disease as an expression of evolutionary potential by parasites when conditions change. And DAMA provides a framework for applying these ideas to actually managing EID in a period of global change. And I think That's the end. Yep. That's the end.
Wow, thanks a lot, Sal. That was really, really good and stimulating. Really
Good.
stimulating. I think that
Thanks.
listening to this really makes us think about what we're doing in our research programs.
Mhm.
That's why I think this is such an important topic that you've grabbed by the throat in these last few years, because more people, if they thought about it the way you're presenting, would have a completely different
Yeah.
view of
Yeah.
what's actually going on. And so
Yeah.
it's important. And what kind of acceptance or discussion are you having with your faculty at your university? What is their take on this stuff? I mean, we know how it is in most places. Is it the same where you are?
Uh, I would say the least amount of discussion and interaction I've had on any of this work is with the people I work with. It's a very like everybody's in their own little silo. So, there's a couple people in the department that I'm close to that they know about this and they don't have any problem with it. They totally get it. But the question is that you're asking that I don't know the answer to because it hasn't happened. But if, let's say, the whole biology, life science building was all exposed to this and they read this, what would they think? I have no idea.
Yeah,
Probably a lot of them wouldn't like it. Yeah.
yeah, because it flies in the face of their um, micro
Yeah.
observations of what they're trying to do. So yeah, so any other comments from out there in the world? I don't want to comments or questions. Mine was kind of a deep, politically motivated question, but
Yeah.
we should have some biology questions.
Yeah. Well, and your question is, I think, a prelude to what Dan, I think, is going to talk about next week, having
Yes,
to do with sort of paradigm shifts and how people think about and deal with paradigms. Yeah.
exactly, because people like to stomp those things out. They don't want to see something new because it interferes with their research programs.
And then the interesting thing is that, and I've said this, people don't like something new, but what's fascinating about all this is it's nothing new. It's really original Darwinism and then projected forward, picking up all the elements uh, that are useful along the way, discarding stuff that might, I didn't get into this whole neo-Darwinism versus Darwinism, but that's a whole subtext here. Um, so in a lot of ways, everything that we're talking about, it's a synthesis of, stuff that is Darwinism.
Yes, it's true. And one of the things that popped into my brain while you were discussing the overall aspects of this do you think most of the examples of all of these processes will be shown through paleontological research, or do you think it's going to be shown from our long-term observations of ecosystems, starting as far back as, when the people were first setting up like LTER sites and things like that? Do you think the world will ever be able to integrate those two?
Uh, well, I think both sources of information are extremely informative and have informed. Obviously, a lot of, tons of historical analyses have been done to show things like taxon pulses and oscillation hypothesis um, and again, just looking at the record of mass extinction and re-diversification, really, it's all evidence of evolutionary potential and all the things we're saying. But it would probably take actual real-time ecological studies to show the details of like, here's an ecosystem that we observed in real time be perturbed and things shift around and and new trophic interactions form. So yeah, people will probably show that. But I would also argue that the evidence is staring us in the face all the time. I mean, every time you see an introduced species or an invasive thing from somewhere that wasn't here before, or,
Right.
COVID, all this, in a lot of ways, it's so obvious that it almost becomes trying to argue for its importance, under the weight of how obvious it is, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Yes, it does. It's an interesting thing.
I would say that you
Carl.
don't have to go in deep time in paleontological studies. Dan and I and Ida and T. Michael Fink have approached Chagas disease, Trypanosoma cruzi, adaptation in both North America and South America. And because of the number of mummies that have been analyzed from the Andes molecularly to identify the variants of Trypanosoma cruzi, we can define the earliest interactions of humans with a pathogen, what variants adapted to the earliest humans as they carried out their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and then the 3 to 4 variants that emerged in different spaces as people began agriculture.
Yeah.
And I think that
Yeah.
combining our standard mummy study approaches with molecular biology is powerful in evaluating uh, the Stockholm paradigm.
Absolutely. Well, and also, Scott, you mentioned LTR studies,
Yeah.
right? So in addition to what Carl said, another really powerful, because again, any direction you can come at the problem obviously is worthwhile. But I think that's another really powerful way to look at this, is the kind of study, and I know you guys are talking about going out and redoing the frog parasites out there in Nebraska, like 50 years later or so. But those kinds of studies also I can see would be really powerful in showing this, is like, 50 years ago, here's where the frogs were, here's where the parasites were, here's what frogs had which parasites. 50 years later, there's been perturbations, the environment's changed, the landscape's changed, there's been developments. Here's what's still here. Here's new associations that popped up. This parasite moved up here and is now in this frog, and so on and so forth. So I think those types of studies are also very powerful for all this.
Very cool. Yes.
I
Go ahead, Carl.
From the paleoparasitological or paleopathological realm, there is now the emergence of one paleopathology, which is an approach to integrate One Health into the archaeological and paleontological, paleoanthropological record. And this, at the same time, of course, we have the application of the Stockholm paradigm to paleopathology. The challenge I have is trying to explain the Stockholm paradigm to people who don't have ecological training.
Yeah.
Because when I really get into the Stockholm paradigm and trying to explain it to people, I myself have a very difficult time grasping the concepts. And it's been battering my head against the wall for several years before I have a minimum grasp. And my colleagues don't have the ecological training at all.
Yeah.
Yet, what we can offer the study of paleopathology is evidence of the interaction of humans and animals, and with an evolutionary context. It is much more difficult to do that with a basic application of One Health to paleopathology.
Yeah.
How would you suggest I approach explaining the Stockholm paradigm to general folks?
Well, the way I might do it, for example, with parasitologists, let's say, just to make a straw man group that, like you're saying, don't really have not really listening to the theory part, right? How do you get anybody to care? I mean, one way to do it is to work backwards and basically say, hey, there's all kinds of emerging infectious diseases going on. There's all kinds of agricultural pests. There's invasive species and things. How does that work? and pose the question, like, we need to understand mechanistically how that works. And well, to answer that question, you fundamentally are sort of getting into the realm of the Stockholm paradigm. And I guess what I'm saying is, rather than maybe batter someone on the head and say, your paradigm's all wrong, this is the right one, present it as, here's a problem, parasites can switch hosts. Yeah, but parasites are supposed to be extreme specialists and kind of work it backwards maybe and reverse engineer, the whole thing. The other more just tangible answer would be, Dan and Walter and Eric, they published that book, The Stockholm Paradigm, Climate Change and Disease. I mean, anybody that asks me, I always say, have you seen this book? Because it kind of lays it out. So, probably, Carl, the main thing going on here is a lot of times people just don't want to learn something new. It's just, it's too painful to have to think about, oh, maybe I have to rethink these things. So maybe that's also what's going on.
And one paradigm is especially easy to grasp, and one is challenging.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for the advice.
That's good. Good advice. I think that's something that we've all come up against.
Yeah. And I've done this several times, where I've done this twice, where I've done all this and I've not even mentioned the word Stockholm paradigm. I've not even talked about what's wrong with neo-Darwinism. I've just said post switching. What's up with that? How does that work? It worked it all the way back to, it's all about everything has some amount of potential to possibly do something new. Where does that come from? It comes from the nature of the inheritance system, and so
that's exactly the overlap with the one paleopathology development. We're all looking at host switching, and you can go into it in great depth.
Mhm.
And so I guess that's what I've been trying to sell.
Yeah. How did COVID jump from bats to humans and other mammals? Because it had the pre-existing capacity to do so, and the opportunity presented itself, and then it did. And from there, really, that's the whole Stockholm paradigm, sort of in that example.
In gym conversations, talking to people, they often bring that up first. And these are just regular folks who really are perplexed by COVID.
Yeah.
So that's oftentimes how I get into discussions with regular folks. If only trained scholars were as perceptive and curious and frankly terrorized as regular folks, wanting an answer.
Yeah. Well, this is great.
Yeah. Well, anything else out there in internet land or anywhere else for discussion or questions? Sal, this is great. We really appreciate the time that you took to spend with us today.
Awesome.
So,
enjoyed it.
Yeah, and let's see. I think well, why don't we go ahead and well, no other comments coming in. I mean, I have lots of things I could be talking about, but everybody hears me all the time. So let's go ahead and make sure that everyone knows that next week, next Thursday, Dan will give a follow-up talk in these same areas of discussion here at the same place, the same parasite time, the same parasite place, kind of like the old Batman shows. So, and I will be back, and I'll be able to run it from the office there, if everything goes well here. So I will look forward to that. So Sal, do you mind if I go ahead and once the download happens with the recording, that I go ahead and post it onto our Facebook and
go for it.
pages? Okay.
Yeah.
I noticed the last things that we've posted, you get pretty much higher downloads than anybody else, which is pretty cool.
Oh, interesting, because I'm never impressed with myself. So
It's the
my thought when I give a talk afterwards is always, well, that really sucked.
No, I think it's good.